Welcome to the Reconnection Club podcast, the show that helps parents heal troubled relationships with their adult sons and daughters. I'm your host, psychotherapist Tina Gilbertson. Each week, I'll offer you compassion, clarity, and personal development tips designed to help you reconnect, not only with your child, but with yourself. Now let's get started. Estrangement itself is a paradox of sorts, because in order to be estranged from someone, you have to have some relationship with them. My neighbor who lives down the street never calls me, but I don't consider myself estranged from him. He doesn't have my number because we don't know each other. Estrangement is only possible where a relationship exists. So if you have an adult child who's estranged, it means you have a relationship with them. I talked about a couple of paradoxes in part 1, episode 165, so be sure and listen to that one if you haven't already. And harking back to that episode, if your child is making a point of keeping her distance from you, she hasn't forgotten about you. In addition to the two I mentioned last time, another estrangement-related paradox for some parents is one that is extremely hurtful. It usually carries with it a great deal of anguish, and there's so much to this paradox that I devoted a 2-part episode to it, which I'll mention in a moment. The paradox is this: the harder you try to parent well, especially if you make a point of parenting differently from your parents, the less your child may appreciate your efforts. This is such a hard one. There's a lot to say about it, so if you find yourself in this very distressing paradox, please listen to episode 125, The Good Parent's Biggest Blind Spot. I'll link to that in the show notes. One thing I don't recall saying explicitly in episode 125 is that the harder we try at something, and the more important it is to us to get it right, the more tension we typically bring to it. If parenting was extremely important to you, or if you were nervous about it, there was bound to be some tension around parenting. And kids feel that, and some kids do okay with it, and others are more affected. But apologizing for tension in your parenting 20 or 30 years ago may not be necessary. Your adult child may be over that. The more relevant contribution, the one that could help to heal your relationship today, might be to bring compassion and healing to any tension in your current relationship, to the parent-adult child relationship that you share. And that is the subject of my book, Reconnecting with Your Estranged Adult Child. One more big, important paradox for unwillingly estranged parents is this: being in a hurry can delay reconnection. This paradox is so present in so many cases that I refer to it regularly in my work. I've got an article by that title. It's in my Reconnecting book. We talk about it in the forums inside the Reconnection Club, and it's implicit in my Escalation Trap article, which I'll link to in the show notes. And I made a whole episode about the race to reconnect and how not only futile, but how unwise it is to rush the reconciliation process. That was episode 142, and I'll link to all of these in the show notes. Before I introduce you to a final couple of paradoxes, let me review the 4 that I've mentioned so far in these 2 episodes. The first was this: the more you try to persuade your estranged adult child to end the estrangement, the more you may unwittingly persuade them to keep it going. And I said a few words about why that might be in part 1. The second paradox from part 1 was, the more you remind an estranged adult child that you're there, the more they may try to forget that fact, even if they're not successful. And I talked about how hard it is to actually forget your parents, and why that, therefore, doesn't need to be a factor in your approach. In this episode, I mentioned in passing that, paradoxically, being estranged from someone means you have a relationship with them. And then I talked about the third paradox. The harder you try to parent well, the less your child may appreciate those efforts. And do listen to episode 125 because there's so much to understand about that. And finally, being in a hurry to reconcile can itself delay reconciliation. Those 4 paradoxes, to me, they all point to another paradox that I see from my vantage point and that I find disheartening. The less effective a strategy is in ending estrangement, the more parents seem to gravitate toward it, and the more effective a strategy is, the less parents seem inclined or able to follow it. Just like the others, this paradox is exceedingly unfortunate, but it just seems to be true, and I'm not sure that anyone can do anything about it. What we can do is to be aware of this paradox and work on the underlying emotional imperatives that keep these no-win situations in place. When we're panicked, angry, or deep in despair, that's when we're least able to extricate ourselves from these paradoxical behavior traps. Our efforts send us in every direction except the one we want, and yet we can't seem to stop. If you feel like that's happening to you, it's not just you. It might just be the human condition. So cut yourself some slack. We're all amateurs here. We're figuring this out as we go along, and it's painful and it's messy. But for every no-win situation that brings us to our knees, there's always another paradox to lift us up and remind us that in addition to being agonizing and arduous, life is also beautiful and generous. So to wrap up this episode, I'll leave you with a few transformative paradoxes that I perceive to be true. Letting ourselves feel sad ultimately makes us happier. The less we honestly expect, the more we are offered. The less we need people to like us, the more they do. And the more love we give away, the more love we have. Until next time, remember that you are a loving, lovable, and still growing human being. So please take good care of yourself. Bye for now. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Reconnection Club podcast, I invite you to check out reconnectionclub.com. The Reconnection Club is for parents at any stage of estrangement from their adult, child, or children. So whether you've just realized there's trouble between you, you've been living with estrangement for years, or you're newly reconciled but still walking on eggshells, the Reconnection Club is your essential resource for information, support, and continued personal growth. With our courses and workshops, expert interviews, monthly Q&A calls, and a friendly, active community, the Reconnection Club is a wonderful place to be for anyone suffering the pain of estrangement from an adult, child, or children. So check it out at reconnectionclub.com.